This is the inaugural podcast of Report from Impact 2023. Today's guest, Andrew Weissmann.
I wanted to ask you, where do you see the evolution of compliance programs from the department's perspective?
That's a great question. So one of the things I've been really pleasantly surprised by is when you think about the work that was done in the administration overseen by Loretta Lynch and Leslie Caldwell. A lot of the, I think, groundbreaking compliance initiatives are still with us, meaning that they've managed to last through different administrations. And I think the reason for that is they were actually just good policy, and they are good policy. You are seeing different iterations. So you are seeing the compliance questions that they are being, as they should be, revised to deal with more granular issues. For instance, the issue of retention of documents by companies, not having communications that are on evanescent platforms like WhatsApp. That's something there's been much more articulation, although I should note, by the way, that we did have that in the fraud section. It went by the wayside, and now it's nice to see it coming back. So I think that you're going to see a growth in that, as well as I think the idea that compliance is an expertise and that compliance professionals in companies are allies of the same mission that the Department of Justice has, at least from the department's perspective, which is that, as I used to say when I was in the department, you're not going to prosecute your way out of this issue. The way to reduce the risk of serious criminality within a company is to give incentives to good compliance programs and disincentives to poor ones. And I think you're seeing that really take hold as the department educates itself. And where it's going to go in the future, in other words, what different iterations, I think is going to be very much dependent on, as we've seen in the last decade, what issues come up, such as evanescent social media platforms where people communicate in ways that can't be detected. That's not particularly in the department's interest. It's not in companies' interests. If you are in a company that wants to make sure that your employees are not doing something inappropriate. So I think it's going to be dependent on the facts and circumstances that change over time. But I think the idea of valuing compliance and compliance officers is here to stay.
One of the things I have observed in my time in compliance is, I don't want to say there's a dialogue between the department and practitioners, but certainly the department listens to issues that are of concern in the compliance community. So for instance, in sort of 2010 to 2015, there was a dialogue around monitors and monitorships. More recently, there's been a dialogue around recidivist, and will recidivist companies be more punished or more harshly punished?
Or even the issue of what is a recidivist company and whether it's even fair to think of the company just because a problem arises, another problem arises, does that make a company a recidivist? That's obviously, you've touched a little bit of a nerve, because I just don't think that is necessarily the case in the way that it would be for an individual.
But I was more interested in that process of that dialogue. How does that work from the department's perspective?
So I was very focused on that, which was the whole point of making things more transparent was to have that sense of rules of the road. You're dealing here with rational actors. You're not dealing with people who engage in a crime of passion. So you've got people at companies who are capable of, and many companies want to know, what are the rules of the road? What is it going to be expected, so they can conform their behavior or choose to conform their behavior to those guidelines. In order to do that, it's important to have a sense of what do companies, including compliance officers, general counsels, board members, CEOs, different stakeholders, what do they think is important? What do they think is less important? Where do they think it's useful to spend their compliance dollars? There's not an infinite amount of money that people have. So having that feedback, I thought was incredibly useful. That's something that has continued. We used to do tons of outreach on that issue and get feedback, and we do it in formal and less formal ways. I know I've been part of that now on the outside. We've been part of groups that have been heard. The ECI has definitely gone to meetings to make sure that people hear their vantage point, and then the department makes its decisions based on that sort of informed view. As you mentioned, this issue of recidivism was one that the department got a lot of pushback about their initial sort of thinking. And to their credit, they revised their thinking in light of what they had learned.
The ABB FCPA enforcement action came out in December, and it was the first 3-time recidivist in an FCPA case. Yet, many of us thought they received literally a stunning result, largely based on self-disclosure, very close to self-disclosure, extraordinary cooperation, and extraordinary remediation. And that was made clear in the enforcement action documents that were released, the deferred prosecution agreement and the information. Is that dialogue that goes on in those documents also helpful to educate compliance professionals?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what happens in an individual case, and the reason when I was there, we spent a lot of time revamping those agreements to make sure that we articulated the pros and cons, and what we were thinking was that whatever the policy is, it's useful to know how it's being interpreted. How is it actually getting applied in fact? And what did the department consider to be a plus factor, and why? To me, that sort of is part of the outgrowth of the FCPA pilot project now, the corporate policy the department has promulgated, which is trying to make it clear that companies who are held responsible for the actions of their employees that are even in part intended to benefit the company, that if they do the right thing, and there are a lot of criteria for what the right thing is, and they self-disclose and fully cooperate and remediate, that they're not going to feel the full brunt of the law in terms of what could happen, because the much more important issue for the Department of Justice is not what could be done, but what should be done. And so I think when you're seeing those resolutions where there's a particularly favorable or surprisingly favorable outcome, reading the fine print of the actual agreement is trying to, I think, send really strong signals to companies as, look, if you're in this situation, this is a way of helping yourself out.
As we mentioned, you use a variety of forms of engagement as what I see as an educator. We talked about books, articles, podcasts, television appearances, even Twitter. Where do you see these forms of engagement to help compliance professionals or even just individual citizens understand more about what's going on with their government?
I do think it's really important in this day and age to realize that different people consume information in different ways. It is no longer the case that you can put out a book and you can write a report and maybe you can be on one of the 3 major television news shows and that's it, and maybe a Sunday show. That there's so many other ways that people consume information, so that if you are, and that by the way applies as well if you're in a compliance field and you're trying to figure out, I work for a company with 10,000 people, how do I make sure that I can frack down to each and every person to make sure that they are getting this information and consuming it. So having just a written policy on the website isn't going to really cut it if you're really trying to make sure that your policies that come to life and are interesting and read and consumed. And by the way, this reminds me a lot of an issue in medicine, which is medicine's advanced so much by the 21st century, but still a huge problem is how do you get people to be taking the right medicine for their condition and make sure they're doing it on a daily basis. So educating people and thinking about all the different ways to educate people, whether it's on something like Twitter or something in a podcast or in a short form article like The Atlantic or op-eds, and all of those are different ways, and I don't think you can be saying I'm going to do one to exclusion of others.
Andrew, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me.
Thank you for inviting me.